Welcome to the screencast on food production and agriculture. Agriculture is providing food for human population. With a growing human population, there is a need to try to maximize food production. Okay, food is essentially chemical energy, which originally comes from light energy. Okay, and light energy is converted to chemical energy by plants, okay, what we call in ecology we call producers, okay, which are plants, and those can be then eaten by either ourselves or animals that we end up eating, and those are called consumers, okay, and that leads us to things called food chains, which you'll remember from GCSE, which we're not going to study here in particular, but what I want to do is to get across the idea that agriculture involves maximizing the amount of producers that we can grow, and also maximizing the energy flow to consumers. Okay, and those consumers could be ourselves, or they could be other animals that we then subsequently eat. Okay, so this could be grass produced in a field, which is then eaten by a cow, which produces milk. Okay, so what we do is try and maximize the flow of matter, okay, matter which is chemical energy, from producer to consumer, okay, and also to maximize the amount of light energy that the producer manages to convert into chemical energy. Okay, the other thing that we'll look at is there are various non-living matter components within this whole process, things like nitrates, carbon atoms and carbon dioxide, and various other non-living matter which are very important, without which there wouldn't be any means to be able to pass chemical energy from one organism to another. And we'll look at the importance of those and replenishing those later on. Okay? So moving to the next slide. This slide looks at selective breeding in plants, and how selective breeding in plants can be used to produce plants which have got high yields, but also plants which perhaps are disease resistant, and plants which might be pest resistant too. Okay, so what the farmer does is he selects plants with desirable characteristics, he then breeds them, he then selects the offspring with the most desirable characteristics, and these could be high yield or disease resistance or pest resistance, and then he crosses the offspring for a few generations, keeps crossing the offspring, so he gets a new variety of plant which has all his optimal desirable characteristics he wants. If I illustrate that below, imagine a wheat plant. Imagine a wheat plant. Okay, there are perhaps different types of wheat plant that we encounter. We might have dwarf wheat plants with low yield, small ears of wheat, of grain. Okay, so dwarf but small ears of grain at the top. We might have tall ones with large ears of grain, therefore high yield at the top. Now the problem with this type of plant is that it's got a small yield, okay, small ears of grain and therefore small yield. This has got a large ear of grain and therefore large yield. But the problem with this is it's tall. And the problem with tall wheat plants is that they are easily blown over when it's windy. So what we could do, or what the farmer could do, is to cross these two types of plant, and consequently he would get various offspring, okay, bearing different characteristics. So you get this arrangement of offspring perhaps. So he might get some dwarf variety which have got high yield ears, and tall varieties with small ears of grain. Okay, and obviously what his target organism, his desired characteristic in this respect, would be these ones here. Okay, so the dwarf variety which has got the high yield. what he could then do is he would cross those, and that would produce offspring, hopefully, which would all contain our dwarf variety with the high yield. Okay, so what he's got is a new variety of wheat plant which he can keep breeding to produce a new strain or variety of wheat plant which has all got the dwarf variety, so it's not blown over in the wind, but it's got the large ear of grain, therefore producing a high yield. Okay, so that's how selective breeding can be used to use a variety. And so the desirable factors, that's just high yield, and I've used this idea of dwarf, but it could be anything we could be looking for. So it could be pest resistance, resistance to being eaten by a pest, or resistance to some sort of disease. Okay, I add this for interest's sake. Okay, here is all those things that, all those cabbages and various things that your mother forces you to eat when you're young, which you don't really like. They all actually originate from the same wild mustard type plant, which is a type of brassica, and they're all the same species. Okay, but they've all been produced by selective breeding. So none of these would be natural plants that one would find in the ecosystems. Okay, they're the product of selective breeding, so they're all the same, from the same species. Okay, now like a lot of these things, it's not all ideal, in that one of the key problems that you can have from using selective breeding is that you then reduce your genetic biodiversity within your species. Okay, genetic biodiversity, and one of the problems with that is that if a pest or a disease affects your crop plant, because all of your crop plants are the same, okay, it'll affect and kill all of your crop plants. Okay, and this is very topical given the ongoing demise of the banana plant. The banana, the yellow banana that we traditionally eat, is a particular variety called the Cavendish banana, and there is a fungal disease which is killing these banana plants off, and it is having a massive effect on the availability of bananas. So the banana market has declined dramatically around the world because the variety of banana that's grown all over the world is very similar, the Cavendish, and it's all been affected by this disease. Okay, so if you had a wider variety, genetic and biodiversity, it's possible there might be banana plants that were resistant to this particular fungal infection, but because all the banana plants are very similarly genetically to each other, they're all susceptible to this particular fungal infection. Okay, but obviously the advantages of selective breeding is that we can produce plants which have got higher yields and therefore maximise the conversion of light energy into chemical energy, which is essentially food. So moving on to the next slide. This slide looks at something quite similar, but this time with domestic animals rather than plants. Okay, so what we're looking for here is domestic animals that convert our chemical energy from plants, what they eat, into food, whether it's milk, whether it's eggs, whether it's meat, or whatever the animal's producing. The idea here is to use selective breeding to maximise the conversion of that chemical energy from the food that they eat into the food that human beings eat. Okay, so what we do here is we would select the desired characteristics of both male and female. So for example, if it was a dairy cow, we would probably look for a cow which produced the largest amount of milk. Okay, and we would probably look for a male which was also quite large, and we'd mate those, and we would then have some offspring. Okay, and some of those offspring would also have capacity for producing a large amount of milk. Okay, and then we'd keep breeding those with large bulls, and we would get eventually a variety or a breed of cows which all produce large milk. Okay, it may be in terms of cattle, it may be the large male we're trying to produce, which converts his food most efficiently into meat for sale, and therefore we continuously produce or choose large males, breed them with large females to get large offspring. We then interbreed those offspring so that the males within the offspring were all very large. Okay, and we repeat this for several generations to produce organisms which have very unusual shapes. So here's a Belgian blue cattle. Belgian blue cattle have huge amount of musculature, very unnatural, huge amount of musculature. But obviously this cattle converts his grass here into very large amounts of meat, which can be sold at market. So moving on from that, this last slide in this screencast describe how the use of fertilizers and pesticides with plants and the use of antibiotics with animals can increase food production. Okay, so sticking with my efficiency of energy flow from sun to producer and from producer to consumer, one of the problems that we have with producing crops in fields is that we produce the crop, and so the sunlight energy is used to make food. Okay, and for that to happen, the plants have to absorb various non-organic matter from the soil, things like nitrates, phosphates, potassium, magnesium, and various things like that. And what we do is that we then harvest that, so we remove all of those non-organic material, okay, from the area, so it's never recycled. Okay, so as a result, after a few years, the quality of the soil decreases, i.e., it's got low nutrients in the soil, low nitrates, low phosphates, low potassium, low magnesium, etc. So as a result, we get poor growth of plant. Okay, therefore very inefficient conversion of our light energy into chemical energy, poor yield, and therefore less profit for the farmer. Okay, so what the farmer can do is to replenish these nutrients in the soil. These fertilizers will contain these chemical components, nitrates, phosphates, and potassium. Okay, they're called NPK fertilizers, but they'll also contain other trace elements like magnesium, which, as you know, is important in the production of chlorophyll molecules. Okay, so these NPK, nitrogen, phosphates, and potassium, nitrates are important for producing green foliage and therefore efficient photosynthesis. Okay, and also important for producing amino acids to produce proteins, which cause the plant to grow, and subsequently might cause animals to grow that might be feeding on this feed. Phosphates are important for producing strong roots, okay, which absorb nutrients from the soil. Potassium's important for healthy growth. Okay, so those are all elements which are contained in fertilizers. Now, where do we get fertilizers from? Okay, it can be natural farmyard manure, or sewage can be used, okay, which contain all of these components, or they can be artificial, inorganic salts, okay, which are made by man. Okay, so things like ammonium phosphates and ammonium nitrates, potassium nitrates, etc., are inorganic salts, okay, which are all made on the basis of the Haber process to make fertilizers, which can be used. Okay, so moving on to pesticides. Okay, the problems with growing monocrops, as we call them, in intensive agriculture, is that if we're growing a particular crop in a field, that is obviously very attractive to all sorts of other consumers which are not target consumers, consumers which we would consider pests, and they would start to feed on our crop and therefore reduce our yield. Okay, so what we need to do is to control these pests. Okay, and we can use chemicals called pesticides which kill our pests, and these can be specific, which just kill one species of pest, or they can be a broad spectrum pesticide which kills many species. Okay, now these are hugely important. Obviously there's a big lobby against pesticides, or producing organic food and so on, but here's an interesting statistic, is if farmers didn't use pesticides, we would only be able to produce, so the amount of food that we could produce would decrease by 73%, which would have a massive impact on trying to feed large populations of human beings. Okay, so they are hugely important. Okay, however, like our selective breeding, there are problems with using pesticides. Okay, so various issues. So the pesticide could actually kill helpful pests. So insecticides, broad spectrum insecticides, could kill pollinators, which are helpful insects to plants, or the insecticides, pesticides could actually get into the food and actually get through and be eaten by human beings and actually be poisonous to human beings. And the other thing is pesticides, use of pesticides results in pesticide-resistant pests. Okay, and going back to about bananas, one of the problems with bananas is that the fungicide that they spray on these bananas to control the fungus. Problem is that the fungus has become resistant to the fungicide it uses and therefore ineffective. Okay, and has to be sprayed so often that it becomes so expensive that the crop doesn't become viable. Okay, so there's using another example from the demise of the banana crop. The overuse of pesticides has contributed to that, as well as the fact that we've got very little genetic biodiversity within our banana crops because of selective breeding. Now lastly, we're moving on to antibiotics. Okay, now antibiotics are used in animal feeds. Okay, they're used for two reasons. Is they fight infection in the animal, and therefore if the animal doesn't have to use its immune system to fight infection, it can divert energy for fighting infection into growth, which is ultimately what we want from our animals. Okay, and it also can kill bacteria in the animal's gut, which could also utilize some of the food that we feed it with. Okay, so as a result, the animal absorbs more food from its gut, okay, because there aren't microorganisms, bacteria feeding on that food in its gut. Okay, so that can have a dramatic effect. Okay, so down here I've got normal grass-fed cow, and here is a cow which is fed on actually growth hormones, but also antibiotics. Okay, and also on a food which is corn-fed as well, which has got higher starch content than grass. Okay, so as you can see, the milk production of this cow here is much, much greater than it is for this cow here. Okay, and this is partly due to antibiotics. The antibiotics kill various bacteria in its gut, which might detract from the amount of food molecules that it absorbs into its bloodstream and can be diverted into milk production. Okay, and it also fights infection within this cow, so that the cow doesn't have to utilize or to divert energy into its immune system to fight infection. The infection is, if you like, fought for it by the antibiotics. Okay, again, like all these things, there's tremendous advantages of this. Obviously, we end up with a cow which is able to convert chemical energy from the food that it eats into our target chemical energy in food, which in this case is milk. Okay, the same would be true if we fed our bulls with these antibiotics, is that they would grow more muscle and therefore produce more meat. Now, the downside of all of this is that this is a massive amount of use of antibiotics. In fact, something like 80% of antibiotic use is used in animal foods. Okay, so we talk about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The use of antibiotics in animal feed is probably a massive contributing factor to the production of bacteria which are resistant to antibiotics. Now, if those bacteria are pathogenic to human beings, that creates problems, is that we don't have antibiotics which can treat infections caused by these bacteria. Okay, so that's a real problem with use of antibiotics. Similarly, the antibiotics can kill useful bacteria in the gut of the organism and might reduce its conversion of feed into milk. Okay, so as we know, cows have parts of their stomach called the rumen, which is full of bacteria, and if we kill some of those bacteria, we might not be able to maximize the amount of food that we can release from the cellulose that it eats and the grass that it eats. Okay, so that's one downside. Similarly, antibiotics might actually get into the milk. Antibiotics might be secreted in the milk and then be drunk by humans, which could have all sorts of problems too. Okay, so that's some downsides of using antibiotics. So in summary, okay, fertilizers, pesticides and antibiotics. Okay, you need to know a little bit about why we use fertilizers, and why we use pesticides, and why we use antibiotics. And I tend to think about that, going back to my original slide, it's all to do with increasing the efficiency at which we convert, in this case, sunlight energy into food and producers. That's why we use fertilizers. And similarly, pesticides. Okay, we use pesticides on plants to increase our yield. Okay, so that the food that it produces is produced for human consumption rather than pests. And antibiotics, again, it's to increase the energy efficiency of the conversion of the food that animals eat to the target food that humans are going to eat, whether it's the milk it produces or the meat it produces. Okay, so that's why we use antibiotics, pesticides and fertilizers. So that concludes our screencast on maximising food production.